On behalf of the Institute for the Liberal Arts, I'm happy to welcome you to a symposium celebrating the publication of the English translation of David Schreier Petrov's collection, Dinner with Stalin and Other Stories, which has been edited by his son, Boston College professor Maxim Schreier. David Schreier Petrov was born in Leningrad and lived in Leningrad and Moscow as a medical doctor and writer. A Jewish refusenik from 1979 to 1987, he continued to write on Jewish themes despite persecution by Soviet authorities, and was finally allowed to emigrate to the US, where he continued to pursue his medical career as a researcher at Brown University. Since immigrating, he has published 9 books of poetry, 9 novels, 5 collections of short stories, and 3 volumes of memoirs. His son, Maxim Schreier, was born in Moscow and left the Soviet Union with his parents in 1987, received his PhD at Yale. He is professor of Russian, English, and Jewish studies at BC, and has authored and edited 15 books of criticism, nonfiction, fiction, and poetry. As distinguished as the author and editor are, they are not the only reason, or even the main reason, why the Institute for the Liberal Arts has supported this project. The Institute seeks to foster collaborative interdisciplinary projects that benefit BC students, and this volume represents a stellar example of such a project. Literary translation is both immensely important and immensely difficult. It's especially important because it allows us to transcend linguistic and cultural boundaries and to approach an understanding of what it's like to live in another culture, opening us up to works of literature that would otherwise be inaccessible to us. It's difficult because a writer's language is intimately and intricately bound up with who he is and with the essence of his work. Over the years, Maxim has regularly taught a course in literary translation at Boston College, and several of the writers who prepared translations of the stories in the volume have taken this course. Margaret Godwin Jones, Leon Kogan, and Margaret Tadevosian Ordukanian all studied the difficult art of literary translation with Maxim, and were given a wonderful opportunity to participate in the translation of this volume. They are joined in this project by seasoned professional translators Arna Bronstein, Alexandra Flesar, and Amelia Schreier. We will now have a chance to hear author, editor, and translators reading and in dialogue about their collaboration on this book. So welcome.
Thank you very much for this kind opportunity to read and to hear translations. I would like to thank the organizers and sponsor of this event. You made me very, very happy. It's not easy to describe a new collection of short stories in a few brief comments. Too many characters, a multitude of story lines. As a genre, the short story is more fragile and vulnerable than the bigger prose form, the novel. The short story does not tolerate falsity and uncertainty. Shortcomings are immediately exposed on the face of short story. I have always been drawn to fairy tales, legends, and myths. This goes back to my childhood, when I spent 3 wartime years in a remote Russian village hidden in the Ural Mountains. In modern Russian poetry and fiction, admire works that are at the same time fantastical tales and stories of social fantasy. Think of the Strugatsky brothers, those geniuses of social fantasy, or think also of Ray Bradbury. I would like to tell you I met Ray Bradbury, and he even wrote comments to my short stories. He was a wonderful man and brilliant writer. I believe that the short story does not agree particularly well with so-called realistic truth-telling. In a successful short story, each storyline has the potential to be read and perceived mythologically. For example, in the story behind the zoo fence, which opens this collection, there is a hippopotamus who can send the vibes of healing to a young woman fighting a little infection in a nearby hospital. Another example of the story is mimicry. There is sometimes impossible to separate the magic kingdom of marionettes from the real life of puppeteers. Finally, there is the story Where Are You, Zoya, with its mysterious appearances and disappearances of a wild turkey who bonds with the elderly Soviet emigre, the widow of Jewish poet who perished in a gulag during the Stalin years. There are 14 stories in this collection for you to read and in translation and to think about. I would love to tell you more about the individual stories, but let me stop here because the process of summarizing a new book not only arouses one's interest in the book, but also takes away from the pleasure to read and imagining another life. This may also be a good moment to say that I am most grateful to my dedicated translations, among them my beloved wife, Mila, Arna Bronstein, Alexa Flezer, Leon Kogan, Molly Goodman-Jones, and Margarita Ordukanyan. I will now turn the floor to my son, Maxim Schreier, who edited and translated the book. Thank you all for being here. I look forward to your questions and comments at the end of the readings. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and I'm Maxim Schreier, and I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm in my 18th year of teaching here at BC, and it's one of the happiest days of my career here. This evening is a celebration. It's a celebration of love, because translators fall in love with the text they translate, and if everything goes well, the love becomes requited, and the texts fall back in love with the translators, and then in turn, the authors fall in love with the translators. And I think I want to impress upon you that while translators and editors often complain about the perils of translation, it is also a joyful process. And I just want to dwell on this happy thought for a moment, that we are celebrating love of writing, love of texts, love of cultures, and translation as a bridge among cultures, between cultures. That said, I also want to join my father in thanking BC and the sponsors of this event. This book, Dinner with Stalin, was from the very beginning conceived as a project in translation, as a project of translation here at BC, and the bulk of the translations was carried out, as Professor Crane pointed out, by our own former graduate students, and we're very proud of their work because we also feel that they have left BC and entered the so-called real life, the greater world, and they have become professionals and translators. I just want to ask them, as I briefly mentioned their names and affiliations, to stand up and be acknowledged. Margarita Devasyan, who teaches at Hunt College and who lives in New York. Arna Bronstein, who teaches at the University of New Hampshire. And I should say that Arna translates with a close collaborator and friend and a colleague of ours, Alexandra Flechard, who couldn't be here today, but I know she's with us in spirit. And also one other participant, Leon Kogan, was supposed to read, but unfortunately was in a car accident. He's fine, but he just had to, he had to stay in the hospital. But I'm sure Leon, again, is with us and is sending us, great vibes of translation. And of course, Emilia Schreier, who is my mother and my original inspiration to study English, and a wonderful translator and friend, professional friend and personal friend of my father's and of mine. Having said that, I also want to do one more thing. I'd like all the undergraduates who are here to stand up for a moment. Why am I asking? It's okay, guys. This will, by the way, all be on the quiz tomorrow. I asked you guys to stand up to be recognized because you too are translators. And I think as you are reading Russian and Jewish authors in translation, as you are this semester, you're learning that you're not only reading translated texts, you're also becoming translators and co-interpreters of foreign cultures. And without you, our job would be half empty, half hollow. So thank you. Having been said, what we're going to do for you tonight is each translator will introduce one text that they worked on and read an excerpt. And then we will have a moderated discussion. We're very lucky to have my colleague and friend, Professor Michael Connolly, a brilliant linguist who is going to moderate the discussion and who himself has been involved with the enterprise of translation for many, many years in various ways. The collection, as my father mentioned, features 14 stories, and of those 14, 13 are stories of the emigre period. My father, I think, has written about over 50 stories for sure, and in this collection, the bulk of the characters are immigrants who are from the former Soviet Union. There's one story, and it's the one that I'm going to read, and I felt strongly about including it, that my father wrote in 1984. It was a very difficult time in our lives. It was a difficult political time in Russia. It's before the dawn of reforms. The war in Afghanistan was still going on. We had been refuseniks for a number of years. And this story actually looks back to my father's youth in Leningrad and to his Jewish roots. It's a work of fiction, but it also has some autobiographical overtones. And all you need to know is that it's set sometime in the early 1960s in what used to be Leningrad and what is now St. Petersburg again. It's called Mimosa Flowers for Grandmother's Grave. That morning, Solomon worked in animal care. It wasn't even noon, but 300 white mice had been infected with TB bacilli and put back in their cages. Solomon was at a turning point in his animal experiments. If successful, the new method of treating TB could enter clinical trials. There was cause for hope. For a minute, Solomon allowed himself to be distracted from the sweetly pungent atmosphere of the animal care facility. He was no longer irritated by a tremulous ray of sunlight peeking in like an orphan through a bottle glass window. Solomon pretended not to notice Katka, the orderly, who reeked of undiluted alcohol. He was daydreaming. Thank God, the money he had saved up would be enough to buy a dozen stray dogs. He would get the dogs from street drunks who were ready to sell their own soul. Solomon needed the dogs in order to conduct the last experiment before the new method could go to clinical trials. You may wonder about the connection between Solomon's dreams, the saved up money, and the planned experiments on dogs. There was a very specific one. In Leningrad's Institute of Tuberculosis, where Solomon was working on his PhD, they didn't use dogs for experiments or normally keep them in animal care, and no funding was available for this, which is why it would have taken Solomon at least a couple of years to overcome various administrative hurdles and delayed his dissertation defense by several years. Solomon, hey Solomon, you deaf or something? Katya the orderly had ripped him away from his reveries. You are wanted urgently on the phone. Solomon removed his rubber gloves, untied the checkered brown apron, shed his white coat and surgical cap. In the receiver, he heard Aunt Betya's sobbing voice. His Auntie Betya, his father's unmarried oldest sister, lived with his mother, Solomon's grandmother. Solomon, come quickly. Mama is not doing well, Aunt Betya said. Something happened to grandmother. Grandmother's not well, not well, not well. Faster, faster, faster. The chain gear of terrifying words turned in Solomon's mind as he rushed out of the Institute's gates on Ligovsky Prospect and grabbed a taxi as he swallowed with salt tears all the cars, buildings, public gardens, and bridges flashing by in the taxi windows. Finally, the taxi left behind the little park at the corner of Zelenin Street and Chkalovsky Prospect. On warmer days, she would sit here on a bench, flanked by lady friends of many years who regarded her as their elder. Indeed, Solomon's grandmother had no equals in terms of her wisdom and composure and the truthfulness of her heart, but she's not there anymore. And the park itself, overcome by vernal anticipation of change, has lost its snowy pureness. Instead of the snowdrifts, tall, fluffed-up pillows, and on the pillows, grandmother's large face, furrowed and cinnamon-hued, with a beautiful straight nose, solidly shaped eyebrows, a high forehead encased with snowy hair, except that grandmother's eyes, always engaging, shining with a special light of caring about the person she was speaking with, because this person was a living, dear, and inimitable human being, except that these velvety brown eyes, set in a mosaic of wrinkles, were now closed. Solomon leaned over to kiss grandmother's cooling cheek and the corner of her eye, from which the tiny rays of kindness emerged. Grandmother, what's wrong? Can you hear me? But grandmother probably could no longer hear him. Her soul, having exited her body of almost 90 years, had not yet left the room and was saying goodbye to the people and objects she so loved. Aunt Betya, sons and grandchildren, her husband's portrait, the family album, the book in a gilded binding, the TV set and the armchair, everybody and everything. Even though Solomon had always lived in a different apartment on the Vyborg side of Leningrad, since his early school years, he had been accustomed to visiting grandmother 2 or 3 times a week at her apartment on the city's Petrograd side. It's hard to say which was the dominant factor in their friendship. Was it the pity she felt for her grandson, who grew up with a living father, yet without one? Unlike the other children who were growing up in functional families, Solomon grew up in the street amid gang members and was always getting in trouble. Or did fear for her grandson trump pity? Or could it also be that all of these things paled in comparison with the unceasing likeness of character between her grandson Solomon and her eldest son Isaac, her Isa, whom she hadn't seen in over 40 years, her eldest son, who was also a daring seeker after the truth, who suffered from injustice and lack of freedom and experienced the same burning hatred and unconditional love. He, her Isa, was the best horseback writer among the boys of Kamenets-Podolsk, where their family hailed from. And he also scored the best goals and was the most devoted friend. It was he, her eldest son, Isaac, who came home one spring day and said, "Farewell, Mama, Papa, farewell, farewell, Sister Betya, and you, my brothers, be happy. I'm leaving for Palestine to build a new life." He was only 16 at the time when he said farewell to his beloved family. He mounted a horse and later, in Odessa, boarded a ship and disappeared beyond the Bosporus. Isaac knew how much grandmother loved mimosas, the flowers of spring. Middlemen used to buy them in bulk in the south and bring them up north. Like a last kiss, he sent her a bunch of warm yellow flowers from Odessa on the eve of his departure. That faraway spring had long passed, and the summer after it had fired away. Then autumn and winter followed suit. Then spring came again, but no one in the house, neither grandfather nor Aunt Betya nor their brothers, had the heart to remove Isa's wilted mimosa twigs from the room. This is what Solomon's kin began to call them, Isa's flowers. Isaac's letters began to arrive from the Mandate of Palestine. He grubbed up tree stumps, dried out swamps, irrigated deserts. Isa would send them letters and photographs, a halutz. He was bringing that ancient land back to life. In some pictures, he stood among the Bedouins, proud witnesses to the land's past declines and victories. Dozens of letters over a decade. Isaac had become a grown man, but his eyes, the same as grandmother's, still shone with youth. I'm going to skip just a short paragraph and read this. Grandmother was lying in her spacious bed, head resting on a white pillow. Behind the pillow, the backdrop of a dark brown headboard framed the view, as though this was no longer his dear living grandmother, but her frozen, sorrowful portrait. Aunt Betya brought in a tea tray, and all of them, the family members who were already there, had some tea at the round dining room table. Grandmother lay beside them so that one could make oneself believe this was not forever, not for eternity, but just temporary. It was as though grandmother was just tired and had fallen asleep, and the family members didn't wait for her to wake and were having some tea. Then Solomon's father arrived, and his father's younger brother a little later. In half whispers, they talked, mostly about the way grandmother was in life. Solomon found this all bewildering, since each word was simultaneously truth and understatement, some rough assemblage of grandmother's image through their joint efforts. He knew for a fact that grandmother was and would always remain exactly what she had meant to him. Only his heart and her heart conjured up this double vision. Nobody in the world understood him as she did, and therefore he didn't love anybody in the world the way he loved her. They were frank with each other, like two inseparable friends who did not know competition or envy. Nothing could stand between them. Separation by distance, difference in age, intrigues of the jealous others. Nobody could understand their friendship, and the age difference shielded and protected their bond from quotidian jabs and blows. Grandmother lay beneath grandfather's framed photograph. And I'm very pleased to introduce Arne Bronstein, who will read next.
Since I'm starting partway through the story, I'm going to give you an introduction of what happens in the story before I start the reading. A case of mistaken identity or perceived reality or time travel, the story Dinner with Stalin opens with an account of mistaken identity by a memorist who claims to have seen Pushkin after his death in a duel at the opera. The presence of Pushkin is strongly felt by the memorist. The second scene of the story is another example of someone bearing a resemblance to a famous person. The next occurrence of the same ilk takes place after the narrator of the story has immigrated to Providence, Rhode Island, where there is a community of Russian emigres. The scene is at the home of Grisha and Galia, a couple known for their hospitality. It is a special gathering as a friend of Grisha's from Baku is coming to visit and will be at the dinner. This friend was an actor at the Drama Theater in Tbilisi, Georgia, and his arrival is eagerly awaited by his hosts. A sumptuous feast is consumed with wines and vodkas, and the guests wait for the arrival of the actor. When the door opens, Grisha arrives with Stalin, who proceeds to light his pipe and smoke, as well as consume wine and vodka. Stalin questions the other guests, some of whom he says he has met in his Kremlin office. A poem written by Stalin in his youth is recited by the host. Suddenly, Stalin became agitated, his eyes lit up, and he said, "Listen to this poem in Georgian." He pushed his chair back, raised himself to his full, not very tall stature, and waving his pipe around, began to read his sonorous verses in a language we couldn't understand. We applauded again, but this time with complete sincerity. It seemed that a certain balance was established when the haze of imaginations, mystification, or hypnosis began to scatter, and each of us wanted the visiting actor to liberate us at last from this terrible fairy tale that harkened back to an even more horrible time of our real past. But at this point, as they say in Russia, the devil pushed Ella, a song-loving boozer, to remember her accordion. She slid off her chair, darted into the hallway, and returned with her accordion, almost half the size of the musician herself. Ella stretched out the bellows, which sighed thankfully, like the hero of Russian epic songs, Ilya Muromets, after waking up from a long slumber. Stuttering slightly from excitement and all the wine she had consumed, Ella announced, "And now together we will all sing an inspirational popular song from the time of the great patriotic war, March of the Artillerymen." She gave her raucous instrument a rhythm, and we picked up the song. "Artillerymen, Stalin ordered you. Artillerymen, our country calls to battle. From many thousands of guns we shall avenge our mother's tears. For our motherland, fire, fire on." Ella remembered all the lyrics. We followed her and her accordion and sang the entire song to the end. Stalin sang along with us, and when the song ended, he said, "Comrades, let's drink to the motherland, to Stalin." Everyone drank with the exception of my Mira and the historian Alyosha. "And you, do you need a special invitation?" asked our guest from Tbilisi, stretching forth his hand, which had emerged from the sleeve of his army green jacket like a vulture out of its nest, and pointing to his old man's tremorous finger, first at Mira, who was sitting to his left, and then at Alyosha. "We've had enough of this masquerade," Mira's words sliced the air. "But if you really want to know, I will drink under one condition. If you, the genius leader and teacher, explain to us why it is that in order to have peace on earth and humanity's progress, it was necessary to fabricate the Kremlin doctor's plot. Why was it necessary to break the joints of my uncle's arms and legs, he, a famous surgeon who spent the entire 4 years saving lives at the war front? For the sake of what lofty ideal was it necessary to design mass deportations of Jews, as had been done earlier to the Volga Germans, the Crimean Tatars, and the Chechens? For what, if not to complete the genocide of Jews Hitler had started? Stalin was deeply pensive. Mira covered her face with a napkin. Her shoulders were heaving from sobbing. Finally, the leader said, "We wanted to save the Soviet Jewry, poisoned by Zionist propaganda, from the justified anger of the Russian people. It was for this reason that worker settlements with modern housing were built in distant regions of Siberia, for example, Birobidzhan, and factories, plants, and collective farms established nearby. Let my words be confirmed by another doubter. In those years, his father was in charge of the Ministry of Construction." This time, the predatory bird of Stalin's hand stretched toward Alyosha. That's not true, Alyosha intoned. Actually, the construction of housing for future deportees was handed over to Lavrenti Beria, and he made sure that the barracks were built with boards that had spaces the size of a finger between them. My father reported that to the Politburo. He stated that it would be a crime to settle Jewish families in such inhumane conditions. For this, he was immediately arrested by state security police. Don't turn your father into a starving little orphan. As soon as they let him out, he immediately exacted revenge for his own arrest by executing Beria without a trial or an investigation. But what did you want, a new bloody terror? Alyosha asked. By that time, I couldn't want anything because, thanks to your father's unbridled and inflammatory speech at the Politburo, an artery exploded in my brain, which led to my final demise. Your father, although he had always danced to my tune in the literal and figurative sense, was the first to spit into my grave. He even threw my corpse out of the mausoleum. But unfortunately, you're alive now. You have returned from the other side, and you continue to emit a foul odor. Alyosha had had a lot to drink. He had emptied an entire bottle of Black Label scotch. We knew that he was uncontrollable in heated arguments, and we had learned to avoid confrontation. In everyday life, Alyosha was a most civilized and pleasant person. But now, we had never seen him in such a state. His cheeks flushed red, his eyes were darting around the room as if looking for something. He knew exactly what he wanted. Alyosha jumped from his chair, and before we realized it, he snatched Grisha's hunting rifle off the wall. "Stop! You've lost your mind," the guest from Tbilisi shouted and ripped off his glued-on mustache. There's another paragraph to the story, so you'll have to read it to find the end.
Good evening, everybody. I am Emilia Schreier. I am one of the translators of two stories from the book. And I actually planned to say a few words on the art of the translation. Oh, I'm sorry. I moved. But I'll skip what I said already. So I was going to say that I planned to say a few words about the art of the translation in general, but it's really not necessary now, since Professor Mary Crane made a wonderful introduction and said actually on what literary translation is. But still a few words. Each time I start a new translation, I feel challenged, and I feel a lot of responsibility. And the more I work on it, the more doubts I feel, so much so that it comes to the point when I force myself to draw the line and say, I can't possibly make it better. A good translation, you would agree, involves a lot of things. It needs to be true to the original, and it also needs to be able to stand on its own for a new audience. The choice of a single word can determine the arc of the entire word. I have the luxury of being able to translate what I like, and I try my best to make my translation as good as the original. I'm very happy to be the translator of David's stories, and I also was lucky to have the scrupulous, demanding, and very strict, if not unforgiving editor, Maxim. Thank you both. Thank you both for giving me this chance. That's not the whole characteristics. I will now talk a little about A Russian Liar in Paris, one of the two stories I translated for this book. Even the title presented a lot of difficulty for the translator. In the original Russian title, Lgunya Ivanovna in Paris, the noun Lgunya, a liar, functions in place of the first name of the female protagonist, while her patronymic, Ivanovna, daughter of Ivan, represents one of the most common Russian patronymics. There is something of a pattern in the Russian language, a pattern inspired by folk locutions, to add this patronymic to feminine nouns so as to suggest that these nouns, usually with negative qualities or properties, have larger than life proportions. In the English translation, I had to add the adjective Russian so as to signal that the lie in question is a Russian one. The story is set in Paris in the 2000s. The protagonist is a Jewish-Russian emigre writer, a former refusenik, a New Englander. He and his wife, who in the story is named Mila, no relation to me, of course, not even a namesake, traveled to Paris for two reasons. One is the eternal reason that brings Russians to Paris, their love of the city. The other is translation business. The writer is negotiating the translation of his novel into French. In Paris, they encounter representatives of the Russian emigre community, mainly those so-called white emigres whose parents and grandparents had immigrated after the Bolshevik Revolution. They meet with one, Taisia Ivanovna, who edits a journal that promoted Russian literature in France. Taisia Ivanovna appears interested in the author's new novel and wants to introduce him to a good translator by the name of Natalia Borisovna. Taisia Ivanovna and the Russian writer and his wife agree to have dinner together and meet at Le Méridien, a classy restaurant in the Montparnasse. And now I lost the page, I'm sorry. Oh, no, I didn't. We'll certainly have champagne to start with. Agreed? Taisia Ivanovna said and ordered. The champagne was excellent. We treated ourselves to pressed caviar. Jewel, the waiter, brought a bottle of white wine and we each had a glass. When Mila or I gently inquired after Natalia Borisovna along the lines of, is it possible that she got the name of the restaurant mixed up? Taisia Ivanovna dismissed our questions, cackling and helping herself to lobster salad, foie gras, or jellied sturgeon. How on earth did they get sturgeon in Paris, I thought. Now, that's the inviolable Russian-French ties for you. Everything was fantastically delicious, and the wine kept flowing. First white, then red, the order going so well along with a joke about the white and the red Russians in Paris. A funny joke, except one couldn't label as red a bunch of former dissidents, most of them Jews, from the Soviet Union, could one? True, most of the Jews were baptized, but they were Jews and not descendants of the white Russians. We were chatting about all sorts of things, but as soon as the conversation touched upon the subject of Jews, Taisia Ivanovna fell silent, concentrating on the next dish. The rabbit ragout. I must tell you, in all honesty, that I had never tasted anything as fine as that. The sauce aroused the appetite, pushing you to eat more and more, and the burgundy wine which came with the rabbit cleansed the taste buds like water in a fountain, cleansing the marble bodies of ancient beauties. At some point I forced myself, like a drug addict tearing himself from a hookah with opium, to stop eating and asked Taisia Ivanovna again about the translator. Yes, you're right. Let me call her from the bar, she replied, notes of irritation in her voice. I need to remind the reader that in those days, the early 90s of the previous century, mobile phones were not yet widespread, and calls had to be made from home phones or office phones, pay phones, or from such places as bars. Mila and I tried not to exchange glances. We put down forks and knives and waited for the publisher, who was our dinner guest, to return from the bar. Taisia Ivanovna came back, looking like a triumphant victor about to address the adoring fellow citizens. Let's order coffee and dessert. They have the most delicious eclairs here. I have crazy news for you. Again, we followed her lead. The coffee and desserts were served. Finally, Taisia Ivanovna spoke. Natalia Borisovna was about to call a cab to come and meet us here, when suddenly Gromov telephoned her from Nice and urgently requested her presence. She is supposed to check the proofs of his novel, which Gallimard is publishing. They booked a hotel for her, and she's taking the night train. But what about? I could no longer restrain myself. When are you going back to the States? In a week. Well, plenty of time, Taisia Ivanovna answered matter-of-factly as she peeked into the bill brought by the waiter. I was studying the bill woefully and without much progress, hoping only that when I converted the price for our supper, again the problem of translation, from francs to dollars, it would seem less devastating. I must say the prices in respectable Parisian restaurants always remain high, said Taisia Ivanovna. High is right, Mila said. Yes, high indeed, but the quality of food is always excellent. Even during the occupation, as my late father liked to recall, you could get a nice dinner in Montparnasse. So you were in Paris during the German occupation? We had to be. Father was in the Renaissance, even though he officially continued to work as a bank president. And my brother and I, being 7 and 9 years of age at that time, along with our late mother, created the illusion of a perfect French family, so the Nazis wouldn't get suspicious. Father helped the resistance a great deal with both money and counsel. At the beginning, we even sheltered the widow of the poet Korovich, though later she was arrested and deported as a Jew. Taisia Ivanovna asked for tea and another order of eclairs. And so your family continued to live in Paris as if nothing was going on when the ill-fated widow of poet Korovich was at the threshold of the gas chamber? Mila asked. You don't suppose we had to follow her to the gas chamber when we aren't even Jews? The evening, which was botched up by my potential translator's sudden departure for Nice, and all but buried under the gravestone of the huge restaurant bill, nearly ended our association with Taisia Ivanovna, and all because of Mila's overzealous desire to get to the bottom of the truth. I looked at my wife with entreaty, patting her hand and coughing purposely until Mila finally stopped and left Taisia Ivanovna alone. To her credit, the publisher of the journal, where I no longer hoped to get published, pretended that Mila's venomous questions weren't directed at her. After the restaurant, we took a cab and dropped Taisia Ivanovna off at her apartment halfway between La Meridienne and our hotel. Thank you very much.
To continue this topic of how translation is always a process, I apologize for my atrocious voice, by the way, I have a cold. I was rereading the selections in preparation for today, and I realized that I had an unbearable urge to take a pen and start fixing my own translation, except I realized that it was already too late. The story that I will be reading today, White Sheep on a Green Mountain Slope, is set in Soviet Azerbaijan in the late 1960s. The narrator, protagonist of the story, who is of Jewish origin and is a young writer and a recent father, has been sent there on a creative work trip. So we experience the pseudo-exoticism of Soviet Union's Middle East, I guess, or as close as you can get to the Middle East in the Soviet Union. It's a very short but complex short story, and at the core of it lies, like in many of David Sharapetrov's stories, lies the question of Jewish identity and what it costs for people to maintain it, and how it has to be buried and yet somehow preserved. And of course, to further emphasize this issue of ethnic identity, as a background to the story, is this entire set of simmering tensions between different ethnic groups, which successfully debunk the notion of narodность in the Soviet Union, that all of the nationalities get along. Everybody loves each other. It's all a love fest. And here you see a polished veneer of civilized conversations, and underneath it, how much of it is actually not so, and how much hatred there is, and how much buried hurt towards each other. On that exciting note, this happened, can you hear me? I'm sorry, is this better? Yes. I shudder as I hear my voice. This happened a very long time ago, the year my son was born. It was a particularly happy year for me. I had a son, and my first poetry collection came out. I suddenly became a father and a writer. Before that, I had only been a young husband and a young poet. The third piece of luck was my business trip to Azerbaijan. An editor at Knowledge Publishing House, where another book of mine about the intersections between poetry and science was due to appear, said to me, "Daniil, would you like to go on a creative work trip to Azerbaijan?" "Why Azerbaijan, of all places?" I asked. "Well, you have recently been translating Azeri poets, haven't you?" "Yes, I have," I replied. "Why not go then? You'll get a chance to visit the Republic, you'll see the Caspian oil fields, talk to Azeri poets. How bad does that sound?" "It sounds good," I said. "Actually, great. Consider it done." The editor slapped my shoulder. "You leave in 2 days. You'll meet the rest of the group on a plane. See my secretary, Maria Ivanovna, tomorrow about your ticket and per diem. Any questions?" "None," I said, and rushed home to pack for the road. We landed in Baku and were put up in a city's premier hotel. They showed us the promenade along the Caspian Sea, where decorous elders of the Caucasus strolled unhurriedly under multi-storied plane trees. They took us to tea houses, where for hours on end, decorous elders played backgammon, pulling aromatic tea from pear-shaped glasses, a tea that beckoned one to Persia, India, China. After being wound into the coiled seashell of an old fortress, we stood in ancient streets so narrow that a man could hardly pass between the stone walls of its dwellings. And there were many other sights which they took us to see, various people to whom they introduced us, and countless meals to which they treated us. For visitors from Russia, the Caucasus is the stone gate of the Orient, its outpost, a place where one can never escape the festive meals replete with toasts solemn like the mountains and endless like the desert. And the second passage is from a little later on in the story. Someone was playing the piano behind the wall. I followed its sounds to one of the adjoining rooms. Soraya was sitting behind a piano. Next to her stood the Russian pianist. Neither one of them could see me. Soraya was playing, pausing intermittently to say something to the other woman. I could only hear fragments of her phrases, collected in northern Azerbaijan and Dagestan, Jewish melodies, composition class. Unnoticed, I quietly walked out and returned to the living room. The dinner feast was almost over. Once again, we were served tea with preserves, cookies, and other sweets. We raised our glasses to the master and mistress of the house, thanked them for their hospitality, and started to get up from the table. Suleiman showed the guests to their rooms, first the pianist and the singer, then my literary colleagues, one by one. I wanted to follow them, but Suleiman signaled with his eyes that I should stay behind in the living room. I waited for him, not a little irritated. Why was I the last one to be accommodated when I was totally exhausted and when all I wanted was to rest my head on a pillow, pull a blanket over my head, and surrender to the oblivion of sleep? At long last, Suleiman returned and asked that I follow him. We made our way down the hallway, passing by the bedrooms from which, to my deep envy, I could hear the peaceable breathing of sleeping people. Or perhaps I simply imagined hearing it. At the end of the corridor, there was a door which Suleiman unlocked with a key that he pulled by a string out of the pocket of his pants. He turned on a flashlight. The door opened onto a spiral staircase descending into the basement. We went down 2 spiral flights. There, Suleiman unlocked another door using a key that he kept in a side pocket of his jacket. We made our way down a small passage to yet another locked door. The third key came out of the inner breast pocket of his jacket. Suleiman let me in and turned on the light. It was an oval-shaped, windowless room, a room in the depths of the cellar. In a system of using floors to measure a building's level, the oval room would have been on a -2nd floor. I looked around while Suleiman hurriedly locked the deadbolt from the inside. He was silent that entire time. It was as if he were playing the silent game. Was he following the rules of a sect of hermits who gave the vow of silence so as not to distort the truth with words, since any word except the word of God was but a lie? Or perhaps there were other reasons for Suleiman's silence. On the side of the oval room opposite the door stood a small pedestal draped in a white silk cover, which was adorned along the edges with dark stripes and silk tassels, like those on a talis. Resting on a cover was a thick, opened, leather-bound tome with silver clasps. Behind the book, there stood a silver menorah with blown-out candles. I came closer. The pages of the book were strewn with Hebrew characters that resembled unearthly notes recording the music of divine words. Suleiman leaned over, pressing his index finger against his own lips. My family comes from the mountain Jews that were forced into Islam back in a day, but we still remain Jews. I woke up early, just before dawn. Suleiman's stone house was steeped in the stillness of the pre-morning hours. I put on my clothes and quietly exited to the back porch. Right outside the fence enclosing the garden, there was the road, and beyond it, mountain slopes. The young grass, nurtured by the autumn rains that had followed the summer droughts, had colored the slopes green. Blankets of snow lay atop the mountains, or were those clouds taking a rest on the snow-covered stone berths? Green slopes, mountain tops covered with snow and clouds. I saw a white cloud inching its way from the road onto the green of the mountain slope. A cloud? I peered closer. It was a herd of white sheep ascending the mountains. White sheep on a green mountain slope. A shepherd in a long burqa and shaggy fur hat followed the herd. It was a biblical picture of a world I had never known. Mountain slopes, green grass, white sheep, a shepherd. Just like in ancient times, back in Abraham's day, right? I turned around and saw Soraya standing in a doorway. She looked European, a charcoal gray short skirt, a white blouse, black hair draped over the collar of her raincoat, and lips touched up with gloss. Yes, this biblical feeling, music of the mountains and deserts in which our ancestors wandered, I responded. How delightful that you too can hear this. I've been trying to compose music that... Before I had a chance to ask her, what music? May I hear it? Where? A Volga sedan pulled over. Soraya ducked into the car. As it sped off like a temperamental young stallion, she managed to roll the window down and yell something that I didn't quite make out, catching only the words, "In the fortress." Thank you.
At this stage, we'd like to ask the translators to come up and join for a discussion about the work that they've actually done. And the way I'd like to proceed would be to maybe pose a few questions to them, to each of the translators, and then from there we can go to a general discussion. Maxime Davidis, you're a translator too.
I was wondering about that.
Yes. The first observation I'd make was that this is now the second time that I've been able to read these stories. The first time was when I actually saw the texts, and the second time I was sitting there with my iPod and actually reading the texts in Russian as they were translating in English. And what struck me was a number of things which I think should be stated and almost commemorated. The Russian language here is just excellent. It's gentlemanly, it's beautiful, it moves in a way without ever trying to be complex. It has this wonderful simplicity of mind and straightforwardness and beauty that goes along with all of that. So it's not just simple, but simply beautiful or beautifully simple. So I'd like to congratulate, first of all, the author for that marvelous work. Then the translators, I would point out, have also done, you may have noticed these very interesting differences of style in the translations that were presented. And so maybe that's something that we can start to talk about, how people got in these different situations. And the first thing I'd like to do would be to ask maybe Mrs. Schreier, being closest to the author, how did it feel translating something where you could read all sorts of subtexts behind what was actually being written on the surface without giving away family secrets?
Well, if the author doesn't give them away, then why should I? It's very, very difficult to honestly answer your question because in my position, I think, as a translator and a close member of the family, if I may, it has some advantages and it has some disadvantages because I probably do understand every subtext and every nuance and every little thing here and there, which would seem that it makes my task easier. Then on the other hand, it doesn't. Did I answer, or do you want me to?
No, you did, actually. One of my masters always had the maxim, which I've always found useful. A translator should always be as vague as the original.
That's so good. So I was trying to be.
I want to ask the same thing of Maxim Davidovich now, because he's coming at this from a different generation, from a different approach. What happens with the personal items which are in that work?
Well, first of all, I think the privilege of translating one's father is, to some extent, a family circumstance. It's a privilege and a joy, but I also don't think it should be used as an excuse for, inadequacies and infelicities and blunders. In a way, I feel a greater ethical responsibility precisely because I don't want this to be thought of as a family affair. In other words, I think, and I have been fortunate enough to have worked with other authors, both from the present and from the past. I've translated Yuri Trifonov, some really wonderful prose writers and many, many poets as well, with whom I didn't have a familiar connection, although I think every translator eventually feels that they are connected, right, through lines of familiar ties to the authors. My point is, I think the ethics here, when you translate a family member or edit a translation by a family member, is one of greater moral responsibility, coupled with a certain freedom, because I think you also live these texts not only as a professional, but also as someone for whom translating these works, living them, giving them a voice in translation is a destiny, not just a métier.
Given the degree of detachment that a professional brings to this, do you find that actually trying to suppress some of the holding yourself back a bit inhibits your translation work?
Luis, I honestly don't think there is a singular way of answering the question. To give the example, which is very close to my heart, in the story that I read, of course, the story comes alive with a great deal of our personal history and of the history of Jews in Russia and the former Soviet Union. And of course, translating a story like that a couple of years ago is not the same, and perhaps let me make this point, not the same as writing it as my father did in 1984, and not the same as living the events described in the story in 1962, and furthermore, not the same as being born as the grandmother in the story at the time when there was still over 5 million Jews in the Russian Empire. Even after World War II and the Holocaust, there were still 2 million. They're now under 200,000. So in that sense, I think translating a story about the disappearance of Jewish traces in Russia is in some ways also a matter of not just professional responsibilities. There are greater ethics of generational, familial responsibility to history, and I hate to put it so, I hate to speak with such pathos, but I do think that translators are responsible to history itself.
Then let me go to the other side of that same question. You're not going to hold yourself back on the one hand, but on the other hand, you're translating with a mission. Now, how does that affect your translation?
I don't think that's a contradiction, because I think if you are clear about the mission, you can then surrender yourself to the text, relax, and let the text do its job on you. So to me, this is not at all a contradiction. I very much like how you pose the question, but I would hope you would agree, Michaelis.
Oh, I do.
Yeah.
I was hoping you'd say that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to ask also, maybe Marguerite would be the right person to ask about this. We have a lot of what we'll call in this Caucasian exoticism. Do you want to talk about how you deal with that when you're translating, how you incorporate that and keep the, what do they call it, the spice of the translation there?
Can everybody hear me? So to the uninitiated, I'm actually from Armenia, and there are a lot of references to Armenia in the story that I just read from. And as a funny example of an answer to your question, there is a line about how, God forbid, you should ever mention Armenian cognac while drinking at an Azeri's house. And of course, to me, it's hilarious. I see that only I get the joke in this, but there are all these moments. Armenia and Azerbaijan have been at odds, historical and political odds with each other for quite some time. They've been in an armed conflict for the last 20 years, but before that there has been a lot of tension between them as well. And all of that surfaces in the story. Of course, as an Armenian, my heart starts beating a little faster when I read this, but as Maxime was saying, I think that as a translator, you find your responsibility to the text overall greater. And I actually find it to be a fun challenge to try to distance myself from it and try to look at it not with an Armenian's eye, which would always want to gloss the story a little bit in my national favor, but rather to try to see it through the eyes of somebody from Moscow who has traveled to this part of the world for maybe the first time and is just beginning to grapple with all of these, as I said, simmering tensions that permeate the texture of the story. And one of the questions that I've had to deal with, and as an editor, Maxime has made the final call on some of these, I sometimes feel the need to footnote some of the references. And I think that Maxime helped me arrive at a very helpful way of inserting parenthetical information about things like, for example, Mountain Ararat, which is mentioned in the story, which I think a Russian reader would know what the allusions are. But in English translation, we've had to add a parenthetical aside explaining what it is.
Yes, I noticed a number of those, and I'd like to ask Anna maybe about this. How do you accommodate the English reader, English-speaking reader, who will not catch all of the references without making it clumsy and without having to footnote it? Very good of you to tell her not to use footnotes.
Thank you.
That is something that I've had to grapple with because I do translation with Alexa. And so part of my job, she does the first very rough, exact translation, and I do the editing, and then we go back and forth together, literally sitting with both texts and arguing back and forth. And one of the things that I do is try to figure out what we're going to footnote, what we can somehow work into the text without adding words that are not David's words. And so it's a hard balance trying to look at it from an American reader's point of view, and not even from my students' point of view, but the general public. I mean, there's so many different layers, I can look at it from my mother's point of view, and I do that sometimes because I've asked her questions about certain things that have to do with Judaism and references of that sort that she knows a lot better than I do. And then I have to look at it from, okay, if my students were reading it, which is how I first met David and Maxime, was inviting them to meet my students. And then just a general reader that I'm hoping, one of the reasons why we translate is to get these works out to people that normally are not going to have the chance to read them because they don't read Russian. And it's a hard balance. And sometimes I put things in, and then as I'm reading it again and again and again, and still always correcting, even when I read it now, I think, oh, maybe should it be something different there? I take things out and say, well, a Russian would understand this reference, and an American reader probably doesn't, but it's not really worth interrupting the train of reading of an American reader to put that in either a footnote or somehow in parentheses or an explanation by one or two words in the sentence, and just leaving it out and thinking, well, they won't get the reference, but does it really take away from the overall reading of it, so that the reader still gets the essence and, I hope, the feeling of David's words and sentiment, even though they might not get every reference that a Russian speaker would get.
No, thank you, and I must say the results are commendably and highly readable, which is about the best thing you can say, especially when we're in the economy of a short story, where we can't waste words, we can't waste facts, and the rest of it. So this is very fine. I don't know, do the translators want to add anything of their own to this? Because the next thing I would like to do is open up to the audience for questions and comments.
Just wanted probably to add a couple of words to what Arne was saying. I couldn't agree more, because where the translator is, as we all agree, he has to really be very true to the original. But my original is right here, as you asked me at the beginning, how I feel being very, very close to the author. He's right here, and this is where we often clash, because I have to think not only about being true to the original, but how it will translate to the American reader, to the American audience. And I'm often tempted to change, because it almost seems that I could do it better if I change, but I can't then. So we often clash. But,
It worked out.
it worked out.
Well, that type of is a productive tension, I think, that's behind any good creative experience, so that's fine. We have, fortunately, have one of our graduate students here, Eric Jackson, who is equipped with not even the latest technology, but what they call a microphone. It is wireless, however, so if you hear the police frequency or something like that in between, you'll know why. But let's open up to questions. Are there any things that you'd like to address to any member of the panel, or make a general comment? Yes, Dick Tresh over there. Yep, you're it, Dick.
Are there some things when you're translating to an American audience, are there some things in stories that are so central in context that you feel like you actually have, and you don't want to interrupt the story, that you actually have to add some sentences that really weren't there, or add a paragraph, but without this particular context, it's just impossible?
I find sometimes I can add a word or two. I don't want to go any further than that, because I feel that that adds another layer that is not the author's language and words. But I think, sometimes a word or two can just give enough of a context that I also think that if someone is reading it and they don't catch the reference, they can always go and look it up. I mean, if that really stops them from looking at it. I've never added more than a couple of words.
I noticed as I was following things along, watching the Russian and listening to the translations, that there was never more than a few words and occasionally a slight explanation, but never more than a phrase.
Yeah, and also, I just want to add, if I may, also, no, not more than one or two words, as Arne said, of course. But sometimes you really have to. You really have to add something to make it sound right to the American reader, or to just to make sense, because the author here, David Schreier-Petrov, is very much rooted, as he said, into the Russian folklore. And that Russian folklore very often has idioms and meanings that I want to say are impossible to translate, because Maxim here doesn't allow me to say that. He says that everything is possible to be translated, but it's sometimes very hard, and it needs a certain addition, if not interpretation.
So, young lady in the fourth row, yes?
Wondering, maybe look at it.
Oh, excuse me, Margaret, you want to?
Well, I think that I would just mostly reiterate what everybody else was saying, and just add that you don't want to run the risk of usurping a text, especially when you're dealing with a living, breathing author who can read your translation and say, no, but jokes aside, I think that there is so much debate in the field of theoretical approaches to translation about whether the translator's responsibilities to the source text or the target language. And really, while everybody has a very strong opinion theoretically about this, in reality, in practice, when you're a translator, you sort of deal with 40% of responsibility to source text, 40% of responsibility to target text, and to borrow Nabokov's term, 20% of a factor X, which is a sort of gray area in which you, as a translator, have to make very difficult decisions about what you have to do, what you leave, and what you add, and what you take out in order to make the text readable.
Just to add my 2 kopecks worth of thoughts, since just to disabuse, I guess, this gathering of the idea that authors' children are somehow draconian overseers of the enterprise of translation.
They are.
I happen to think it's the other way around. And since Margarit, who wrote a great dissertation on Nabokov and has done a lot of work on transcultural communication and translatability, mentioned Nabokov. I knew his late son Dmitry, have spoken with him on a number of occasions, including in Montreux, where he lived, where Vladimir and Vera Nabokov lived after they moved there in Switzerland. And I can tell you this, the same sort of aura, I think, surrounded Dmitry from the outside, that he was this draconian overseer of his father's legacy. You got to know him, you would immediately discover that once he felt about you as a student of his father's work or a translator, that you fundamentally love and respect your father's works. He really fundamentally loved and respected you, and I just want to tell you, I don't just fundamentally love and respect you, I truly love and respect my father's translators. So it's not that. And also, I have come to elaborate an approach which is one that, rather than footnoting things, I add a section of notes on the text, and this is the 3rd time we've done this as a group, in Jonah and Sarah, in Autumn and Yalta, and in this book. And these notes are a kind of eclectic combination of explanations, explications of context, subtext, and various other things. And I find that it works well. But,
And it doesn't interrupt the process of reading,
Exactly.
like a footnote would.
Yeah, so, thank you.
I can add a little bit. Today I mentioned for narrow circle of the friends and translators about my friendship, maybe not friendship, but my adoring the great Russian translator Tatiana Gnedich. She translated Byron, and she was in the prison 15 years. And Byron came to her cell and tell her line after line all text of Don Juan because she had no books and nobody gave her this possibility. So anyway, she often, when I ask you once, what in your opinion has to be like translation? And she told, translation has to be honest like wife and beautiful like lover. So my opinion is, you have to feel. You have to feel, and because every line in the poems or every line in the prose which you need to translate, it's alive. It's like small animals. You have to touch it. You have to kiss it. You have to talk with this line like a baby. Because if she will believe in you, she will open your heart and you will translate. Thank you.
Hi, I'm truly honored and grateful to be here and take this opportunity to actually meet the author of the book that we in our class have read and discussed. And I wish to ask a question about a story, The White Sheep on Green Mountain Slope. We also talked about this in the class, and we were hinting at we were talking about the illustration of biblical picture in ancient times back in Abram's day, and how that kind of hinted at the land where there will be a peaceful coexistence between the people, despite the different religions or ethnicities. And I was really amazed by the last sentence that you have ended the story, which says, I heard the bells of the caravan camels, the creaking of the desert sand, the tinkling of a brook, and the dying bleat of the white sheep that our forefather Abram had sacrificed to the Almighty, so that one day he would reconcile Abram's two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. So I wanted to ask if you are actually talking about the conflict that is going on in Israel between the Arabs and Israelis. And I was very curious about what you meant by the white sheep, what actually it symbolizes.
You want me to answer now immediately?
I'm sorry for the long question.
Oh, sure. Everybody dreams that this idiotic conflict will be solved someday, solved. Because it's impossible. They are really brothers, Palestinian and Israeli people brothers, and genetic molecular biologists showed, it was published half a year ago, not maybe 5 months ago, that genetically they are typically brothers, the closest people on the earth. Sure, I dream about this, but I cannot figure how to do it. The problem is so hard. I cannot. The only way is to publish this book in Palestinian area and in Israeli area and discuss. Let them discuss book, not discuss territory, not discuss everything, but book. This story, it will be my dream in reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you please answer what actually this white sheep symbolizes?
White sheep, it's we. We are white sheep. Intelligence, it's white sheep. Because we are first who goes to the under the knife.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
We have other questions or comments? Yes.
How much influence does illustration have to keep the attention of the reader in the poetry? I think it's poetry that you write. We're very visual, and it's sometimes we can be caught off guard by the story and not continue the story, be caught by words, keep going, but having visual artwork in the book keeps our focus, tends to keep our focus on the story. How much involvement in the illustration is done in this book?
Maybe.
It's a fabulous question. Specifically to this collection, I can say with a lot of pride that we were able to realize my father's wishes precisely because, as my colleague and friend Michael Connolly has very, very astutely pointed out, there's a lot of caucuses in the book, and it is, in a way, a kind of model of interethnic, interreligious, racial relations. And so my father wanted something of the Caucasus to be on the cover, and his first thought was to draw on the art of the great Georgian artist who is often thought of as primitivist. I don't think he's a primitivist. I think he's more complex than most of us, Niko Pirasmanishvili. And the National Art Museum in Tbilisi in Georgia was extremely kind and supportive, and they sent us a very high quality slide and gave us permission to use it. And I think, to me, this is a perfect illustration of how paintings that sometimes hover above the text or, above the author's creative mind, then, come to illuminate the book. So, Seth, I think that to me is not just an illustration. In a way, it's a kind of capsule, some essence of the book. It's a feast, but it's not just a feast of food. And it's also not just a feast of celebration. It is, to some extent, also, an experience that is bittersweet.
I'll speak less. You've talked very theoretically about translation and the art of translation. Can you give some concrete examples of difficulties that you encountered going from the Russian to the English, or specifically from David's Russian to on English that you thought the audience would best understand? I remember taking a class with Everett Fox, Everett Fox, who teaches at Clark, or taught at Clark, and about his translation of the Old Testament.
Fox, you mean, Everett Fox.
Yes, Fox, of the Old Testament, and he talked about having to come up with word combinations that weren't really English in order to make as close to literal or as close to true. And I wonder what you encountered in going from David's Russian to English.
I'll gladly speak to that because we were actually talking about it earlier today. And if I may start with a little personal digression, the first time I tried translating a short story by David Schreier Petrov, I was a newly minted graduate student at Boston College, and I read it and I thought, this is going to be a piece of cake. I know every single word in this story. I'll translate it in a day. And it took me about 2 months to arrive at a draft that I found palatable. And I find that translating his prose is deceptively difficult because, as he mentioned in his introductory comments, he relies very heavily on the oral narrative tradition and on this oscillation between short nominative sentences and very long sing-song imitations of oral storytelling. And these oscillations depend very heavily on repetitions of key terms. And of course, because in Russian the nominative sentences don't have verbs, but are meant to reproduce visually still images, you can see how this poses a syntactic problem in English. And so when you do a first literal draft of a story and you look at it, it looks atrocious in English because then you have to really struggle to recapture this melody and the rhythm and the cadence and make the decisions about which key terms you're repeating and which terms you're not repeating because you can do without. And I think that, to me at least, has been probably the most challenging part of translating every single one of his stories. More specific examples of what you're saying about putting words together to create words modifiers. One of the short stories that I translated in his collection is called, do you speak Russian at all? Кругосветное путешествие. Кругосветное is in around the world, but it's used as a single adjective in Russian. And in English, you have to come up with a composite, significantly clunkier, hyphenated round the world or round the globe happiness, which does not have the same melody or the same punch and is a lot heavier for a title. In fact, I think Maxim and I went back and forth quite a bit about how to properly capture the title.
Oh, Margaret, let's also tell a story about Zhuzha. That's a great story.
Oh,
Don't you think it's my favorite story about
In-
this?
in the House of...
It has to do with a story that Margaret translated brilliantly, and I contributed to a little bit. It's called The House of Edgar Allan Poe, and it's set in Providence, Rhode Island, and it plays on the idea of how today's students of Poe, especially Jewish Soviet emigres, are somehow doubly captivated. In this case, there is an emigre professor who comes to Providence to write a book about the myth of Poe in Russia, but he's not just interested in Poe and how Poe was courting Sarah Helen Whitman. He's also interested in a graduate student from Moscow who's collaborating with him. And basically, he gets caught in a web of certain fantastical but also very realistic representation of events, including there is a magic beetle there. And in the Russian, the beetle is called zhuzhelitsa, although we don't really know whether it's a female or male. But the nickname of this bug is zhuzha, which is an abbreviation of zhuzhelitsa, and it's very lovely, and it's also euphonically, it makes perfect sense. But of course...
and it suggests hints at a feminine gender,
Correct.
which in English is a lot harder to reproduce.
And so basically, we ended up renaming the bug. And it's not called Zhuzha, it's called Beata. Why? Because we felt that Beata is a great name that's Eastern European. It suggests beauty, and it has this aura. So now the beetle is called Beata. And also, of course, there is the play on B.A., Beetle, Beata. So that, I think, worked out just seamlessly.
Yes, though I have to credit Professor Schreier
No,
with
no,
coming
no.
up with the alternative.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed the presentation. I've always loved Russian literature. Let me see if I can speak a little loudly. I was thinking, these are just some thoughts that you may address, but I've ended up with a question. The King James Version of the Bible, I think it's the 23rd Psalm, maketh me to lie down in green pastures. I prefer that so much to the new translations, which I thought took away a lot of the poetry. Anyway, here's my question. I saw David Lean's Dr. Zhivago. I saw Masterpiece Theater's version of Dr. Zhivago. I always wanted to read it. And I was faced with two translations. One, the original English one, which was modified somewhat, but I think it came out around 1960, late 50s. And then a more modern version. And I started reading the more modern version, very flowery. And it seemed to miss the essence of the Russian as I had appreciated it in Nabokov or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or whatever. And I'm wondering if you have an impression one way or the other on the translator or some insight on the translation of that classic, Dr. Zhivago, which is the preferred translation in your mind.
Well, I don't, because of course I read Dr. Zhivago in Russian. Why should I read it in English? I've never read it.
I can just tell you personally, I certainly prefer Max Hayward's translation, which is the classic one you're referring to. It's badly in need of editing, which still has not been done for very complicated copyright reasons, which I've had to deal with because we included a section from that translation in my anthology of Jewish Russian literature, one of the few exceptions, because all the other, we have three, Nadezhda Mandelstam, from her memoirs, from Pasternak, and one other text. But basically, it still is a wonderful, monument to literary translation, and I still prefer that to the other one that I think you described accurately.
I'll just mention that we were talking about a month ago about translations of Chekhov. And I think we both agreed that in fact the old Constance Garnett Victorian translations were still the best and most solid ones to read, despite the fact that there are some modern translations that you will find as bestsellers.
Well, there's a whole group of students here who are reading in classics of Russian literature, or reading Russian literature in translation, and they just read Crime and Punishment in Constance Garnett's translation, and I think we all enjoyed it. I'm sorry? Louder, please. There's a whole group of students here from classics of Russian literature who have just finished reading Crime and Punishment in Constance Garnett's translation, and I think we were in agreement about its virtues, and we're now beginning to read Anna Karenina in a modern translation because everything else is out of print, and it's a disaster. And in general, let me voice my utter
Are
discontent.
you reading the Bafowska Pavir translation?
Yes,
Oh.
because luckily, we can produce new translations and we are free to do so. But what's happening with the classics of Russian works in translation is that they're going out of print, and that's just terribly sad, wouldn't you agree, Arna?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I remember the first novel that I ever read in Russian was Dr. Zhivago, and I had to do that for a graduate course. And it's still one of my favorite novels. And I just remember when I went to teach it for the first time in translation, I just felt this gap. And you kind of, when you teach literature and translation, you have to make a decision of what it is you want the students to get out of the novel. And it's different than when I was reading the novels in a graduate course and we were reading it in the original and discussing it in Russian. And it's a totally different novel in a sense. Not necessarily better or worse. Because, I mean, I love teaching literature to my students. I don't get to do it very often. I teach mostly language now. But still, I just think that, there's different ways of looking at novels, and it's not necessarily better or worse when you're reading it in the original or in the translation. It's just different.
I actually, as a very interesting exercise in translation, not in literature, at the beginning of every translation seminar I teach, I make my students read the opening paragraph of Anna Karenina in 9 translations. And I have them vote on which translation they like best. And I'm always invariably surprised to find out that most of them vote for the Constance Garnett translation, although we have also affectionately turned Garnett into a verb in my translation seminar, which means to omit something that you don't know how to translate.
Not to conclude at all, I just wanted to say that every discussion leads to a new discussion. We had a wonderful discussion of the book today, and I'm very happy that students are here and their questions, everybody's questions, wonderful. Is it Julia? I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you very much for your question, and you were quite insistent about that white sheep, and rightly, of course. And I'm very grateful to you in particular to ask that question because, I just somehow didn't think so much about what white sheep is to us, the readers. And I think David explained it so wonderfully. He really uncovered something new for me. I'm very happy. And as a translator, I just wanted to add that, I was not trained to be a literary translator. I had a very rigorous training as a translator, but in a different field. It was business translation, it was political translation. This is what I was trained to do. I had wonderful teachers for that. So when I started to do literary translations of David's works, he really taught me a lot. He taught me a lot to understand what's between the line, what is each word may mean when you think about it, when you give your second thoughts to it. And I'm very grateful to him for that. And of course to Maxim as an editor. They were two great teachers who helped me to make the translation, I hope, better.
If I could also just do one thing, as I say to my students sometimes, and now a word from our sponsor. There are copies of the book actually available on a table outside. The bookstore has made some copies available. So if you're interested now and you've been attracted, I must really say this is a highly readable collection. And you will, in fact, want to read some things 2 and 3 times to get into the levels of what's going on in them. They're like, very much like the folk tales that are the oral literature that's informing this. Because, as you know, you can read a fairy tale 10 times over and see something new in it each time. And this is very much the same at the level of these stories as well. So, if there are no further questions, I'd just like to do one more thing, please, and salute the author and the translator.